The seventh science and engineering practice mentioned in NGSS is engaging in argument from evidence. And many of the activities that we do in a science classroom have a tremendous amount of evidence, and yet students only look at a small portion of it. The beauty of CSCS is it allows us to aggregate all of this evidence so students can look at a large pool of data rather than just their individual data. In this activity, we're going to illustrate how students can argue from evidence to answer some genetics questions. To illustrate the value of CSCS lessons in helping students engage in argument from, look at a simple CSCS lesson listed under biology. And you can see here that some pictures of some of those common traits. This actually was made by a collaborative document. You can see there's a few different authors and so forth on here that put this together. It could have been far more, but three of us worked to make this particular document. And this basically lists some common, easily observable traits. And so what the students are asked to do is to look at the diagrams and so forth and determine if they're a tongue roller, if they have widow's peak, attached earlobes, hitchhiker's thumb, etc. And as they go through this, they are inputting a 1 if they have it, a 0 if they don't. So it's kind of a binary decision whether they have the trait or don't have the trait. So now we can start to look at the evidence that's generated by all of the contributions. So if we look at this, we'll see that we have contributions from just about 200 individuals here. So lots of individuals have participated in this. And you'll notice over here this last column here, column L, is blank to begin with. And around row 45 it enters in with some data. And this is just surveys and so forth in midstream and still collect data. And so we decided to add this other one, which is a non-visible trait, the ability to phenylcarbamide, which is a kind of a bitter taste to those who can taste it. And so when we look at the data, you can see the phenotypic relations right here. And you can argue, okay, that tongue rolling is the most common of these traits, and then PTC taster is the next most common. What students oftentimes think is they think that because something is common and because it is uncommon means that it's recessive. In fact, if you looked at this evidence here, it would tend to suggest that we see these two things here are more than 50%, and they are indeed both listed as dominant over here. Tongue rolling is dominant and PTC tasting is dominant. And when you look at red-green color blindness as a recessive trait, certainly it's not a very common trait. And so students tend to think that if something is dominant, it will be common in the population, and if it's recessive, it'll be rare. But as you look through this data, when they can argue from the evidence, realize that this doesn't always hold true. Some characteristics here, like mid-digital hair actually happens to be a dominant characteristic, but 50% of the population, which therefore implies that 57% of the population, in other words, 50 are recessive. So 57% have the recessive gene expressed in terms of the phenotype. And you'll notice that dimpled chin, although it's a dominant characteristic, it's only found in about 18% of the population. And freckles also being dominant, only found in about 23 or 24. So what this does is it helps the students see by looking at maybe the data from an entire grade or maybe the data from an entire class. They can see patterns, and it'll help resolve some misconceptions as they argue from the evidence, realizing that in this particular case, that dominant doesn't necessarily mean more common, and recessive doesn't necessarily mean rare, but the original definitions of what dominant and recessive mean, in terms of if you have two alleles, one being dominant, one being recessive, then the dominant one will be expressed. But in terms of the frequency of those alleles, we can see that it doesn't necessarily follow the